I'm Fran Morley, and today I am interviewing U.S. Army Chaplain George W. Lassett, who was born October 9, 1925. Mr. Lassett served during World War II as a radio man and then later as a chaplain, and he remained in the Army until 1978, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. We're speaking today, May 17, 2011, at the Fairhope Public Library in Fairhope, Alabama, for the Veterans History Project in the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. Mr. Lassett, welcome. Thank you for coming in. Let's start with a little background information. Tell me what you were doing before you entered the service in 1944, and a little bit about your family and where you grew up in Citronelle.
Well, I didn't grow up in Citronelle. I was born there, but my mother died when I was about 2 months old, and I went to South Mississippi to live with my grandparents. That was the usual case in those days, and I had no brothers or sisters, and grew up the first few years in near Waynesboro, Mississippi, with my grandparents, who raised sheep and cattle, ran them on an open range, and it looked like something from Texas every now and then, with the horses tied at our gate, and on a cattle drive or a sheep gathering. That's what he did for a living.
Now, when you joined the military in 1944, was this right out of high school?
Yes, I saw it coming and managed to cram enough extra subjects in to get graduation requirements. I think about the middle of December, although I had tried to enlist in the Army and the Navy before, I could never pass the physical, and yet I thought I was healthy as I could be. But a pair of bad tonsils kept me from a commission, and waited for the draft. I got my high school diploma on the 23rd of December, and I got my draft notice on the 24th of December.
And the draft didn't care about your bad tonsils.
They didn't care about it at all. So I went over to Camp Shelby, Mississippi for a physical exam, and was sworn in early January, and a week or so later went to active duty.
And you were a radio man during World War II. Is this something you chose to do?
No, I had intended, like many others, to go into pilot training, but toward the close of the war, the military felt that they'd had enough prospective pilots and bombardiers, and they washed us all out for the convenience of the government. As a consequence, they sent me off to gunnery school first, and then because I objected to flying a ball turret of a B-24, which left you right naked to the enemy, they sent me then to radio and radar training, and it was rather extensive, and I graduated a year later and from Boca Raton, Florida. I had an attempt to act as instructor, which I didn't like the idea, and so they assigned me to a unit, and I went to Grand Island, Nebraska, to maintain radios and radar units on B-29 bombers. Stayed there until the end of the war, and actually I got out earlier than some men who had been in longer, because the base was declared surplus, and it gave me some extra points for discharge, and away I went to civilian life in 1946.
And then what happened in 1946?
Well, I went back
What changed for you?
Mississippi. By this time, my father had married again after my mother had passed away, and he was managing a plantation near Tunica, Mississippi, just south of Memphis. The biggest gambling casino on record. I think it's even bigger than Vegas. And to think of my high school days and some of my buddies, that's how they lost their money. But Dad gave me a job of maintenance man. I worked on tractors and farm equipment, welding and that sort of thing. And I had picked up the operation of a cotton gin from my boyhood days, and that's what I was doing. About 6 months into 1946, I felt God calling me to the ministry, and it's a rather unique experience. The fact that I knew it myself. My father didn't like the idea. I was the only child, and he had other plans for his only boy. So it took a while for us to resolve this problem, and it finally got out of the way. But I was changing the head on a John Deere tractor in the middle of the morning. Somebody had cracked the head on it because of running it without water. Two men came, parked on the turn row, and came up to where I was working on the tractor. They said, "You're George Lassett." Yes. Somebody told us you'd be out here. We are, and they introduced themselves. One was a director of missions for in the Clarksdale, Mississippi area. And the other was a preacher, strangely enough, from Baldwin County. And they said, "We're trying to resurrect a church from the dead." I said, "Resurrect the church from the dead? The only one I know of is Berea. When I left here to go into service, it had been abandoned, and a man was storing hay in the little old building. But we've cleaned it out, and we found 2 or 3 of the old members, and we'd like to get things started. We hear that you are a singer." I said, "Yes, I have led singing in church for many times." "Well, would you come and lead the singing for us?" I said, "I'd be happy to do that." When I got through working on my tractor, I got home and cleaned up a bit and went down to lead the singing in a revival meeting. And it was quite an experience for that church, because I had gone to school with some of these kids who had now grown up, and yet it was a challenging experience. They were very poor, most of them sharecroppers in that congregation.
Is this what led you then to the seminary?
Yes, I realized that I couldn't tell anybody how to get in out of the rain, so I said, if I'm going to help people spiritually, I better do some training, get some training myself. So I immediately enrolled in Clark College, a small junior college that was really concerned about men who had been out of the service out of high school a long time and needed some help getting readjusted.
Did you enter seminary with the idea of going back into the military and being a chaplain?
No, that is another story. I finished Clark College, moved over to Mississippi College, and stayed there long enough to get a bachelor and a master's degree. I thought maybe I might teach some along the way. And then went on to seminary at New Orleans and got my Master of Divinity degree there. And I pursued this graduate business a little further. I went to the University of Alabama, was accepted into the graduate school, and was planning to teach somewhere along the way when I got through. One day I was in the line getting registered for a new course. Someone touched me on the shoulder and said, "There's a gentleman who'd like to see you down the hall." I had no idea who it might be, but I went down afterwards, registration, and there's this rather dignified gentleman that, with a name like Beale. Beale, where do I know? No, I don't know anybody named Beale. He said, I'm the comptroller of the university, but I'm also commander of a skyscraper battalion here in the reserve, and I have just lost my chaplain. He's retired, an old World War II battle horse, and I heard that you just graduated from the seminary and you are eligible for a commission as a chaplain. Would you be interested? I said, no, sir, I wouldn't be interested, because I know if I got in the service, in the reserve, the first time somebody fired a gun, they'd get me, because I have a critical MOS. They need radio and radar mechanics. I know that. Well, he said, let me come at you with another angle. I know that little old Baptist church that you're serving out there just out of Northport, they don't pay you very much. If you came into the reserve, that $100 a month that you'd get for going to drill would put a little more bread on the table for you and your family. I said, now I can understand what you're saying. That makes sense, and I'll take you up on your offer. So I went through the process. A chaplain has to be cleared as any other officer.
Yeah, tell us more about that. How did preparing to be a chaplain in the military differ from your seminary training?
Well, the preparing to be a chaplain comes later, but you get your theological education and whatever you need to serve as a minister. Now, not all students out of New Orleans, some do, but most of them don't come into the chaplaincy. Now, I had 3 or 4 of my classmates that enlisted in the chaplaincy, and I served with them eventually over the years. But back to the story, I joined the reserve as his chaplain, and I immediately went off to chaplain school at New York, and that's where I learned the basics of what a chaplain does on active duty. Surprisingly, it isn't anything that you can have a problem with. You are simply a minister wearing a uniform, and you are required to have a theological degree and to finish a theological accredited seminary before you can be commissioned. You have to pass a physical like any other individual. You have to pass a test of your loyalty to the country. All that done, you are now a chaplain with a rank of a first lieutenant. And at the chaplain school, you learn, because not many people had prior service. You learn how to march, you learn how to salute, you learn something about regulations and who you're going to be working with, a platoon or a company or a battalion, all the way up to a division. And I might say I started at the bottom and I came out at the top 24 years later, because I eventually became the division chaplain of the 95th Training Division. And that's a company, I'll say it's an organization that has 4 brigades of over 1,000 men each, and 2 chaplains to every one of those brigades, and assistants, not chaplains, but assistants and they are there to help you do what you do for the commander. The regulation says that the religious program of a unit belongs to the commander, and so he's your boss, and he tells you what to do. There's no conflict because he is concerned about the spiritual welfare of his people, and you're the guy who's supposed to run it for him. And if you run it in the ground, you'll be sorry the last day you lived. So I went to the chaplain school, and that's not the end of it. You go back periodically to go up the ladder in preparation for places of service in larger units. And it may be after you've been to a unit like that, or you may not. You may just have to get in there and swim or die.
So what was it like when you first started? What were your responsibilities?
My first job was to find somebody to play the organ. But I found a young man that knew how to play an organ. We had little portable organs about so-and-so size that the pictures will show a boy playing the organ, and that's not the only source of music that we had. Wasn't easy to carry an organ around because of a suitcase when you travel. So I carried a tape recorder sometimes with some music, and I'd flip it on, and we could sing with the tape recorder as a piano or an organ. You were then assigned to a unit when you got back from the chaplain school. And of course, I was already assigned to this battalion in Tuscaloosa, and once a week I went to drill on Saturday, and also they allowed me to come and do an early morning service for the unit at 8 o'clock, and then go back to my church and do the service there and come back for the rest of the afternoon. And you do with the troops just what you do with your congregation. You counsel those that want some spiritual advice, family affairs. I am sorry that it seems to have occurred in transition that chaplain was primarily a spiritual leader and a preacher to the troops. But now, unless you take hold of the bulls by the horns, you spend all your time counseling. And not every chaplain is qualified for counseling. You get a little counseling training, but you don't learn it that quickly.
You mentioned that the chaplaincy in the military goes back to George Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just tell us a little bit briefly about the history of that?
Well, we don't know how or why, but Washington decided he needed some ministers with his troops. They have that need. They've come out of civilian life where they've been used to this sort of thing, and simply because they are fighting a war and put on combat clothes doesn't mean those needs are automatically met. And so he brought, and strangely enough, mostly Episcopal, because he was a Church of England background himself. And he found that it worked. Chaplain was a real asset. And it has trickled on down the years since then, and it's become legalized as a staff position in the military now. And he gets pay according to his rank. He has no authority, though. I might point this out. Chaplains they are addressed as chaplain so-and-so. Every now and then somebody who doesn't know says, Colonel so-and-so, Now that may tickle his ego, but really his rank is just for pay. And sometimes he forgets it, sometimes he doesn't. But the chaplain goes by the term chaplain, and he is not to be a combatant. Now, along the way, and including myself, there have been, when I was in, you were not required to carry a weapon, but you were allowed to carry a weapon. And it's always been my my feeling that when you're out in the combat zone and that man sees that cross up there, it makes a good target, and he shoots him just as dead as if he didn't have one. Well, there was one or two occasions when I never shot anybody. Now, I even put a magazine of bullets in, but I believe you, Mama didn't raise any stupid kids, and I wasn't about to go beard the lion in his den without some protection for myself. I didn't wear a weapon openly, but discreetly I carried a .45 under my vest in a shoulder holster.
Now, you started out in Tuscaloosa, but
Yes.
where else did you serve here and abroad?
Well, I finished my work at the university and transferred down to Laurel, Mississippi, and was teaching in Jones Junior College as a history professor. And all of us, well, one of the Fifth Army chaplains came by and said, "Would you like an active slot now that you've moved down here?" I said, "Fine." I liked the idea, so he had me assigned to a vacancy in a field hospital in Gulfport, Mississippi. Well, that went well. I was allowed to make drills with my old unit in Laurel, rather than traveling all the way to the Gulf Coast. And strangely enough, the Berlin crisis occurred, and they started talking about active duty. I said, "Oh no," but they said, "Oh yes, we are going to be called." And that unit was called and assigned to Fort Sam Houston, Texas. And it was there that I had my first experience of being a chaplain on a post. And I was assigned to Liscombe Road Chapel and had 2 young assistants and a musician, and we ran it just like we were running a church anywhere else. Of course, you found it difficult sometimes just because you had church and rang the bell that everybody was going to come. If you didn't go where they were, they weren't going to come where you are either.
You mean you would hold services someplace other than the church?
Sometimes in the field, and I have a picture of, not everybody would come, but being a Baptist, it was out of my field. Although you're not required to conduct a service of any other denomination, like Jewish or Catholic, because that's a separate ball game. But a general Protestant service, I always tried to make it relative to the background of the people who were present.
Is that something that they taught you in chaplain school, that you had to be versed in the different Protestant religions?
No, I already knew that from seminary, and I was aware of the fact that I had Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians and Pentecostals, all of these, and if somewhere you can't speak their language, you might as well get lost. They don't need you, but they're going to have needs in their family life and in their personal life like any other person, and it's not going to be beneath your dignity. If so, you shouldn't be in the chaplaincy. This Methodist kid comes to you with a problem, you better know how to help him, Same thing with any other denomination for that matter. But I conducted a general Protestant service every Sunday, and I also did what Baptists do, prayer meeting on Wednesday night. Everybody in the world goes to church on Wednesday night. So I got along well, but I even bent a little bit more, although in a Baptist church you won't find Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and many of the other things. I did it because it was another opportunity to relate to people and meet a need that I knew they had been used to in their civilian life. And I think it worked well. And I never found myself in a jam because of what I was doing for them. And it always worked well with the commander.
Well, when did you go overseas as a chaplain?
I went overseas in Vietnam. I had gotten out after 3 or so years at Fort Sam, and of course I went on the Cuban crisis at the same time. I think I told you that the only time I was ever proud of myself, I got a young chaplain in, didn't know how to get in out of the rain, but he brought his wife and kids down there, and all of a sudden we were ordered to move out and go down to South Florida in preparation for the possibility of invading Cuba. And I just couldn't see him leaving his wife and children. And I wasn't married at the time, so I said to my commander, would it be all right if I volunteered to go in his place? He said, if you want to, it's all right with me. So I made a friend out of the chaplain, and I went with the crew. And we stayed about 12 weeks in South Florida. It gets a little monotonous, and I spent a lot of time doing counseling, because after about the second week we began to hear some Dear John letters. And so I stayed on the go, where those units were strung out all the way from Orlando south to the Keys, for that matter. And we never unpacked, because the 82nd Airborne had all their stuff there, ready to go into Cuba, into Guantanamo, and we were going to go right in behind them and set up a field hospital, because we were sure we would have some casualties. Well, the balloon didn't go up, but we finally took our marbles and went home back to Fort Sam Houston. Somehow or other, they started probing around me, and they said, do you know you're a brittle diabetic? I said, oh, you're kidding. There's no diabetes in my family. And he said, well, you're not to the point that we would mandatorily discharge you, but I have a recommendation, and I don't have any facts to back them up. If you got out of the service and lost about 20 pounds and worked hard for a while, you might get well, or you might become a severe diabetic. I can't tell you. But so I took his advice and got out. And I did exactly what he said do. I was teaching at University of Central Arkansas at the same time as serving a church in the suburb of the town of Conway. And you say, well, how do you do all of that? When you do what you got to do to get well, you'll do anything. And I worked like a Trojan. I lost that weight, and I got my diet under control. And within a year, it was all gone. And doctor can't tell me why. So I went back into a reserve unit, the 336 Ordnance Battalion, which was being built up for Vietnam. Little to my knowledge. I didn't know all of that, or I wouldn't have been that dumb. But back to my diabetes. I'm a diabetic now. It came back with a raging Cajun. and I'm on a medication now. 2 or 3 other things and they said it's probably as a result of exposure to Agent Orange. I said, well, I'm a witness to that. Everywhere I went, the boys had defoliated the country, and so I was right in the middle of it. In fact, I had some controversy with them one time on a claim, and I said, well, now wait, let me give you some evidence. I'm a rated pilot, and whenever I needed to go to a unit, if there was aircraft available, I went by air rather than in a Jeep, because you won't live long on the ground. Well, another thing too, by being a commercial pilot, I was allowed to fly as the alternate, and it saved them putting another pilot on board, so long as the chaplain goes, and I was on the road all the time.
You're speaking of your service in Vietnam now?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the unit was activated, and we went to Fort Carson, Colorado. I took leave of absence from the school. I resigned, and my church, and the things worked out so that I made the transition without too much difficulty. I was a major at the time, and during the early weeks at Fort Carson, Colorado, in our preparation for Vietnam, most of our staff officers went to a refresher course at Huntsville, and we were left short-handed. And then all of a sudden, the adjutant of our unit fell down with a heart attack, and they shipped him off to Denver to the hospital. The colonel looked at me and he said, "You're going to be the adjutant." I said, "You're crazy with the heat." I was pretty bold, but he said, "What do you mean I'm crazy with the heat?" I said, "It's against regulations. A chaplain cannot command. In a supervisor position, you can call it whatever you want to, but he has no authority to command, and it's against the regulation." He said, "Well, we'll keep it out of writing, and you're just going to be the adjutant answerable to me." I said, "Oh Lord, if you ever get caught, I'm going to swear that I don't even know you, that I just strayed through the base here." But I served as the adjutant in getting the unit in preparation for Vietnam for about 2 months. It involved, well, I said to all my troops, I don't ever want to be anything other than your chaplain, but an emergency has occurred, and I'm going to do what I have to do, but you remember who I am, that I'm wearing 2 hats, and I'm going to be back as a chaplain one of these days. And I think that I did a service to a man who did not know us. And they brought in this extra commander from outside, and I think because I had been with the troops for 2 or 3 years, that I was able to be their chaplain and be their adjutant at the same time.
How was working with the young men in Vietnam different from the other troops you've worked with over the years?
Well, it worked the best you can imagine. Most of our troops were young, 21 or 2, 3, 4 years old. Most of them unmarried, and yet they were people who were in college and pretty sharp guys, and they were able to grab the situation and their jobs and do them almost to perfection. In fact, we have a presidential citation with a cluster on it as a result of the efficiency of those boys from out of Little Rock, Arkansas. They didn't have to be told twice what they needed to do. They ran a tight ship.
And this was an ammunition battalion?
Ammunition battalion. At the time we were there, the 3 divisions that we were supplying ammunition to were shooting up 3/4 of the ammunition used in Vietnam at the time. We had 3 divisions that we were supporting, the 101st Airborne north of us, and the 2nd Marine Division in Da Nang, and the Americal Division on our south. And we had companies that received and stored and issued that ammunition on request from these using units. And they did it with such accuracy that you can't imagine people that transition out of school, out of civilian life, and in 2 months' time, they're running a stock control system like old men.
Were you primarily on base, or were you out in the field?
Well, we built our houses on China Beach, on sand pile, and that's what we lived in. But we had these units strewn out all over from the DMZ to about 400 miles south, and we're supplying their ammunition. So our headquarters stayed in one place, but the guys that handled the ammunition were out there, wherever. Well, for every brigade, we'd have an ammunition supply point, an ASP as it was called. A using unit from the Americal Division comes up and said, we've got to have 1,000 rounds of whatever it is, and they said, well, bring your truck in here. Let me see your request order. And they would go out there and pick it up with a forklift, put it on his truck, make him sign a receipt, and away he'd go. Now, if you think that inaccuracy could be was tolerated, you didn't know Colonel Jim Bishop, my commander. He would eat you alive for making mistakes. Now, he said, one thing I do, you make a mistake and you can tell me about it, but you tell me a lie and I catch you in it, I'll kill you. And he used to say, you know, we're not pigs, we're hogs. We went by, we were called the Arkansas Battalion, and our slogan was, ooh, pig soy. And our decal was all over anybody's Jeep that parked in our territory. A red hog would be on there. Well, they used to take bets with the man in charge of the whole supply system in Vietnam. And Bishop would say, well, my unit is accurate in, oh no, Colonel Bishop, there's nobody that accurate. I'll bet you a filth of whiskey that I can find something, an error in your stock control system. The Bishop would say, I'll take that bet. And he would say, pull a card out of the stock control system and say, you're supposed to have 3,000 rounds of something, this ammunition. Have you got it? Yes, we've got it, Colonel. And he would go out to the ASP, and they would physically count every round of ammunition in that pallet. Bishop won every time. That's how accurate they were. And I think it's the reason why we had that presidential citation too, because we knew that those guys were depending on us, and we had to give them what they had to have, and no fooling around.
I would imagine that dealing with the spiritual needs of men in a combat zone, would be quite different from dealing with those needs back at a base in Arkansas. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that's how I became a circuit rider. You know, the old terminology of Methodists that used to ride a horse across the country. Well, I didn't ride any horses while I was over there. But beginning at home base in Da Nang, I held a service about 8 o'clock on Sunday morning. And when I was finished with that group, I went over across a barbed wire fence to another unit that did not have a chaplain assigned to them, but whose commander came to me and said, I would appreciate you coming over to my unit and helping me. I've got some problems, and I believe that availability of a chaplain might be able to help solve some of my problems. Well, it did. And so with those two services at home base, then I caught a plane and went south to the Americal Division, and a company that we had down there, a company headquarters. They had an ASP. I stayed with them on Sunday night and did a church service. Monday morning, I got on my best thumbing a ride, and I rode a chopper or a light plane that was being used as a observer. I'd ride down to our other ASP, and on Monday I'd do a service for them. The only person that we lost in the entire year came from that unit. A young man, married, from New Jersey, a Lutheran. He walked out to meet me on Monday morning of a certain day, and he said, kind of grinned, he said, have you seen your church? I said, oh, come on, don't pull my leg. He said, well, let's go around and see. So we walked around the corner of the orderly room, and there's this tent sitting there with a big cross on the front of it, and some pallets in the floor so that you weren't walking in the dirt, and a little platform with an altar and a podium there. He said, me and the boys decided to fix it up for you. And I will never forget that morning I served communion. And he was one of the first to walk down the aisle and kneel at the altar and receive communion. The next day, he told me, I'm coming back up to headquarters. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay. The plane that he boarded went down because of bad fuel. It crashed and burned everybody on board. I had difficulties with experiences like that, but it had to be done. And that's the only man we lost, and it was not because of hostile fire. Well, that's a sample of what I did. I went to the next place, and the next place, and the next place, until I met myself coming back.
And how long were you in Vietnam?
A year.
And then did you retire from the service
No,
after that?
I met the commander of the 95th Training Division in Vietnam. He was an Archie, a doctor. His name was Herman Hankins, 2-star general, and he came to visit us. And he said, "I'd like to have some of you guys come into the 95th Division when you come back. I don't have very many people who have had any active duty, let alone combat duty." Well, I propositioned him right away, and I said, "I know that I am going to outrank the man who's going to be the commander of this unit when it gets back to Little Rock. And I'll have to get out somewhere because I outrank him, and that can't be according to regulations." Well, he said, "You come see me, and I'll see what I can do." Well, when we got back home later on, I gave him a call, and he said, "Well, you go meet with the boys at my support group in Little Rock, and we'll find an assignment for you sooner or later." It's like manna from heaven. I joined the 95th Training Division, and he did an unusual thing for me. I don't know whether he would have done it for anybody else. It doesn't matter. But we had what we call man-day spaces, extra paydays, duty days. And that division was a training division with a division in Shawnee, a brigade in Shawnee, one out in the west, in some podunk town that I don't remember, another one in Little Rock, and another one in Alexandria, Louisiana. And he said, "Here's my proposition to you. You're going to be my chaplain, and nobody's going to be your boss but me." And he said, "I haven't got but half staff of chaplains throughout the division. I want you to enlist and recruit and help train those that you find to fill these slots." I said, "I can live with that." But he said it will involve a couple of days every week, probably on the weekend, and if you're willing, it'll be paid just like you were on active duty. So I had 8 years left before I had to retire. So I jumped at the opportunity, and I built a good retirement during those 8 years. In the meantime, the division chaplain retired, and where did he put me? He walked me right up front. And he's never forget the introduction. He had me out in front of the whole headquarters. He said, "This is my chaplain. I want you to know it. Don't you mess with him. He's going to do what I want him to do. He's going to hold a service here when this division meets, but he's going to be out there in the boondocks recruiting chaplains." And I had a good experience of serving when I thought maybe I might be in the closet somewhere after that. But that kind of service went back to normal, and we had people that I was meeting from different churches and different denominations through 3 states: Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. And it was quite a growing experience for me because I never had tried to manage that many people before. And believe you me, there's an experience, a slogan I heard not long ago that adequately describes it. A Methodist, my son is a lay Methodist preacher, and he was talking to one of the local pastors in Arkansas who wanted him to supply for him while he was gone. But he said, now I have to warn you, they're not all going to be there. It's, you know, church members down here are sort of like trying to herd a bunch of cats. So trying to manage that many chaplains throughout the division is like trying to herd a bunch of cats. But I had no problems, and I enjoyed it, and I thought it was a good experience administratively on my part, because it was a responsibility, the planning of budget, of personnel, and activities throughout the division.
I have just one final question for you. You stayed in the ministry after you retired from the military.
Yes.
How did your experiences over the years as a military chaplain affect your whole persona as a pastor?
Well, you probably would have to ask those that I ministered to. I came to Alabama. We bought a little place at Dolphin Island, and after spending a few weekends over there, Hurricane Frederick came along and blew the bridge away. Well, fortunately, I still had my plane, and I used to fly in there a lot, and we made it pretty good. But I just kind of got tired of living with all the desolation of what a hurricane can do. And a lot of my friends were gone, and I was finally of a mind to go look somewhere else. We got across the bay and came to Magnolia Springs. And right away, in Baldwin County, we have about 60 Baptist churches. And at any one time, there will be at least 10% of those churches without a pastor. And there was opportunity here galore to serve churches with people that need. Well, now, we didn't, I didn't get right into it. A friend of mine from seminary called me and said, I hear you're retired, but I know you haven't got anything to do. We're going back on tour, on appointment to Kenya. They were missionaries. His wife was a doctor, and Buck was a preacher. He said, your wife is a nurse, and she can hook up with my wife, and they can work the clinics. And you and I will build churches and train pastors. Can you come? I said, we'll be there. So we spent 6 months enjoying the best part of our lives with those people, and thoroughly appreciated the opportunity. Well, when we came back, we got busy doing local church work. There's some of these churches that I served 2 or 3 different times. First Baptist Church in Foley, I was interim pastor of that 3 different times over the years, from a year to a year and a half. I went up to Silver Hill for a year and a half there. Fish River down the way, Gulf Shores, Alberta, Summerdale, and then last on the staff of First Baptist Church here. A new pastor came, and the minister of education left. He said, I've got to have somebody. I know that's not your field, but you'll do till I can find somebody. So,
kind of like your military experience.
Administratively, I didn't have any problems. They kind of sometimes didn't like the rough attitude, because I was not unkind, but I didn't put up with any foolishness. And I think every now and then a church needs somebody to be firm with them. The pastor is too kind. I say that because I know he's got to keep. They can pull a rug out from under him, but they can't do that to an interim. He says, I've got a living, and you do this to me if you want to, but I'm not going to starve to death. So I just forgot the military for all practical purposes and just dwelt upon the need of that church. Many of them were hurting experiences that they were having. Lord, I hate to tell you, but 3 or 4 of them, pastors are gone with some woman in the church, you know, and you have to help them get over an experience like that. It's devastating to them. Well, fortunately, I was able to read their writing and meet their needs. Good for me and good for them too.
Yeah.
And I'm about worn out now. I'm 85 years old and about used up.
I doubt that. I doubt that.
Someone asked me how you're doing. I said, well, I've been through 2 wars, had 2 open heart surgeries, and a plane crash, and a dog bite. Otherwise, I'm doing pretty good.
Well, we thank you very much for coming in today, and we thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you.